In the final hours of daylight on July 17, 1996, the airfield at New York's JFK Airport buzzed with activity. Travelers moved with a mix of anticipation and exhaustion, eager to begin journeys that ranged from leisurely vacations to critical business ventures. Among the evening's scheduled departures was TWA Flight 800, a transatlantic route bound for Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport. The Boeing 747, poised majestically on the tarmac, seemed like any other plane preparing for a routine journey. Yet, in just a matter of minutes, it would ascend into the skies and into the annals of aviation history for all the wrong reasons. The flight carried 230 souls, each with their own story, their own hopes for the future. Among them was a group of high school students from Montoursville, Pennsylvania, embarking on an educational trip to France. Their excitement was palpable, a reminder of the boundless optimism of youth. Also on board were a retired Navy officer, a celebrated sculptor, and a newlywed couple on their honeymoon. The passengers represented a diverse cross-section of life, united only by the shared journey they were about to take. Trans World Airlines, once a titan of the industry, had seen better days. Financial struggles and competition from upstart carriers had taken a toll, but TWA clung to its legacy of international service. Flight 800's Boeing 747-131, known for its robust engineering and safety record, had served the airline for decades. Despite its age, the plane underwent regular maintenance and had passed all required checks. Its departure on that summer evening seemed as ordinary as the hundreds of flights that preceded it. As the clock neared 8 p.m., the crew began final preparations. Captain Stephen Snyder, an experienced pilot with over 17,000 flight hours, led the team. At his side were First Officer Ralph Kevorkian and Flight Engineer Richard Campbell, both seasoned professionals. Together, they formed a cohesive unit, their camaraderie evident in their easy banter and coordinated movements. In the cabin, the flight attendants ensured everything was in place for the journey ahead. From the passenger's perspective, the evening was shaping up to be uneventful. With clearance from air traffic control, the engines roared to life, propelling the massive aircraft down the runway. By 8:19 p.m., Flight 800 lifted into the air, its trajectory carrying it northeast over Long Island. Passengers gazed out the windows, watching as the lights of New York City faded into the distance. The cabin hummed with quiet activity as travelers settled in for the overnight journey. Approximately 12 minutes after takeoff, the plane had reached an altitude of 13,700 feet. For those on board, there was little to indicate anything amiss. The crew monitored the instruments, noting the steady climb and normal readings across the board. In the cabin, flight attendants moved through the aisles, preparing for the first round of service. The passengers, lulled by the steady rhythm of the engines, relaxed into their seat. On the ground, however, a handful of eyewitnesses noticed something unusual. A faint streak of light seemed to follow the plane as it moved through the evening sky. Some described it as a glow, others as a flash, but all agreed it was peculiar. Unbeknownst to those on Flight 800, the tranquil atmosphere aboard the plane masked a brewing catastrophe. Inside the cockpit, the first sign of trouble came in the form of a sudden and brief fluctuation on the instrument panel. To the experienced crew, it was a minor anomaly, the kind of blip that occasionally occurs but resolves itself quickly. They exchanged a few words, deciding to monitor the situation closely. A few moments later, the fluctuation was followed by a series of abrupt warnings. Systems that had been stable just moments earlier now registered irregularities, and the calm professionalism of the crew shifted to focused urgency. Before the pilots could fully assess the situation, the aircraft was rocked by a massive explosion. The sound was deafening, a violent roar that reverberated through the fuselage. In the cabin, passengers barely had time to register what was happening. The explosion, originating in the center fuel tank, tore through the structure of the plane, severing critical systems and plunging the passengers and crew into chaos. For those on the ground, the event was both sudden and horrifying. Witnesses reported seeing a bright flash in the sky, followed by a fiery trail as the plane began its rapid descent. Debris rained down into the waters of the Atlantic, scattering across a wide area and leaving a fiery glow that illuminated the night. In the cockpit, the crew fought desperately to regain control. Amid the chaos, Captain Snyder and his team worked with practiced precision, their training and experience guiding their actions. But the damage was catastrophic, and the plane's systems were failing rapidly. Communication with air traffic control was cut off, leaving the controllers helpless as they watched the radar blip for Flight 800 disappear from their screens. As the plane broke apart midair, passengers and crew faced their final moments. For those on the ground, the immediate aftermath was a scene of devastation. Emergency responders rushed to the area, their efforts hampered by the sheer scale of the disaster. The waters of the Atlantic, once calm and inviting, were now a chaotic mix of debris and flames. Despite the best efforts of rescue teams, there were no survivors. The crash of TWA Flight 800 had claimed the lives of all 230 people on board. What followed was one of the most extensive and controversial investigations in aviation history. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, working alongside the FBI and other agencies, combed through the wreckage, seeking answers to what had caused such a catastrophic event. Initial theories ranged from mechanical failure to sabotage, each carrying its own implications for the aviation industry. The investigation ultimately concluded that the explosion originated in the plane's center fuel tank, likely triggered by an electrical short circuit. However, this finding did little to quell public speculation. The dramatic nature of the crash, coupled with the absence of definitive proof, fueled conspiracy theories ranging from missile strikes to deliberate sabotage. For years, debates raged over what truly happened to Flight 800, its fiery end remaining a haunting mystery. In the wake of the tragedy, the aviation industry underwent significant changes. New regulations mandated improved fuel tank safety measures and stricter maintenance protocols for aging aircraft. The families of the victims, left to grapple with their loss, found solace in efforts to memorialize their loved ones and push for greater accountability in aviation safety. The crash of TWA Flight 800 left an indelible mark on the industry, serving as a stark reminder of the fragile balance between human ingenuity and the forces of nature. Approximately 12 minutes after takeoff, Flight 800 climbed steadily into the twilight sky, reaching 13,700 feet. From the outside, the aircraft appeared to be following its planned course without incident. Passengers settled into their seats, some chatting, others flipping through in-flight magazines, while a handful closed their eyes, hoping to sleep through the overnight journey to Paris. In the cockpit, the crew worked efficiently, checking systems and maintaining communication with air traffic control. Captain Stephen Snyder, a man with decades of flying experience, felt confident about the flight's progress. Beside him, First Officer Ralph Kevorkian and Flight Engineer Richard Campbell monitored their respective instruments. It was routine work, the kind they had performed countless times before. But even the most experienced aviators could not have predicted what was about to unfold. On the ground, however, scattered witnesses began noticing strange phenomena. A few boaters off the coast of Long Island saw a flicker of light, almost like fireworks. Others described it as a glowing streak, something they'd never seen before in the evening sky. What none of them knew was that the faint illumination was the first visible sign of the catastrophe already unfolding aboard Flight 800. Inside the aircraft, everything seemed normal until a sudden anomaly flashed across the cockpit's instrumentation. It was subtle, a brief flicker of irregular readings on one of the fuel tank gauges. To the crew, it appeared insignificant, a minor glitch that often resolved itself. Yet, beneath the floor of the cabin, in the sprawling labyrinth of wiring and fuel systems, a deadly combination of factors had begun to align. Unknown to the crew, a small electrical short in the wiring system had ignited vapor in the nearly empty center fuel tank. The 747, like many aircraft of its era, relied on systems that had aged significantly since its manufacture 2 decades earlier. While the plane's exterior and engines had been meticulously maintained, the internal wiring was more vulnerable to wear. At that moment, a spark within the center tank turned the otherwise inert vapors into a ticking time bomb. The explosion was sudden and catastrophic. A deafening roar echoed through the aircraft as the center fuel tank erupted, creating a fireball that tore through the fuselage. The blast sent shockwaves throughout the plane, severing critical systems and splitting the aircraft in two. From the cockpit, Captain Snyder and his team barely had time to react. In an instant, their control over the aircraft was lost. Emergency systems failed, communications were silenced, and Flight 800 became a vessel of chaos hurtling toward disaster. In the passenger cabin, the scene was one of unimaginable terror. The explosion caused immediate decompression, sending unsecured objects flying through the air. Passengers screamed as the once ordinary flight became a nightmare. Some clutched their seats or loved ones, while others could do nothing but stare in horror at the fiery glow that filled the cabin. For the flight attendants, trained to remain calm in emergencies, the situation was beyond anything they had prepared for. The force of the blast rendered many unable to move, while others were swept away in the chaos. Outside the aircraft, the explosion was visible for miles. Witnesses along the Long Island coastline described seeing a brilliant flash, followed by a fiery plume that streaked through the night sky. Some believed it was a shooting star. Others thought it might be a missile or some kind of military test gone awry. Regardless of their initial impressions, all who saw the event understood that something catastrophic had occurred. For the air traffic controllers monitoring Flight 800, the radar screen told a chilling story. Moments before, the 747 had appeared as a steady blip, moving predictably along its designated path. Suddenly, that blip vanished. Efforts to contact the crew went unanswered, and the controllers could only watch helplessly as secondary radar picked up smaller, scattered echoes, likely fragments of the disintegrating aircraft. The wreckage of Flight 800 began its descent into the Atlantic Ocean, spreading across a wide area as the plane broke apart midair. Fragments of the fuselage, seats, luggage, and personal belongings rained down into the water, creating a fiery, debris-strewn scene. Emergency responders on Long Island received the first calls reporting an explosion over the ocean. Boats, helicopters, and Coast Guard vessels scrambled to the area, hoping to find survivors amid the wreckage. As rescuers arrived at the crash site, the scale of the devastation became clear. Flaming debris floated on the water's surface, illuminating the scene with an eerie, orange glow. Despite their best efforts, searchers found no survivors. The impact had been so violent, so sudden, that those on board had little to no chance of survival. Bodies and fragments of the aircraft were scattered across miles of ocean, a heartbreaking testament to the force of the explosion. Back on land, news of the crash spread rapidly. Families waiting at JFK Airport for updates on loved ones grew increasingly anxious as the hours passed with no information. When the confirmation finally came, it was devastating. All 230 passengers and crew members aboard TWA Flight 800 had perished. As rescue operations shifted to recovery efforts, the mystery of what caused the explosion loomed large. The public was desperate for answers, and speculation ran rampant. In the immediate aftermath, theories ranged from mechanical failure to terrorism. Some witnesses reported seeing a streak of light rise toward the plane just before the explosion, fueling rumors of a missile strike. Others pointed to the aging aircraft and the potential for a catastrophic system failure. Investigators faced immense pressure to uncover the truth. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, working alongside the FBI and other agencies, began the painstaking process of piecing together the wreckage. Divers scoured the ocean floor for fragments of the plane, while forensic experts analyzed every recovered piece for clues. The scene was both haunting and overwhelming, a silent graveyard of twisted metal and shattered lives. As days turned into weeks, the enormity of the tragedy continued to resonate. The loss of Flight 800 was not just a technical failure, it was a human one. Families mourned their loved ones, grappling with the senselessness of the disaster. For the aviation industry, the crash was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the fragile balance between technology and safety. What began as an ordinary flight had ended in catastrophe, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and enduring grief. The explosion of TWA Flight 800 was sudden, catastrophic, and unforgettable. At precisely 8:31 p.m., as the aircraft soared over the waters south of Long Island, a deafening roar shook the skies. Within moments, the Boeing 747, a symbol of engineering triumph, was torn apart by an explosion so violent that it sent shockwaves rippling through the plane and the surrounding air. Witnesses along the coastline watched in horror as a fiery streak lit up the night, followed by an ominous silence that signaled disaster. Inside the aircraft, chaos reigned. The passengers, moments ago reclining in relative comfort, were thrust into a nightmarish sequence of events. The explosion that originated in the center fuel tank had obliterated the structural integrity of the fuselage, splitting the plane into multiple sections. The initial fireball scorched through the belly of the aircraft, releasing heat and pressure so intense that it compromised the cabin. The resulting decompression hurled unsecured objects and passengers alike with terrifying force. For those in the forward cabin and cockpit, the experience was both instantaneous and disorienting. Captain Stephen Snyder, alongside his crew, had only seconds to register the explosion before their instruments failed entirely. The cockpit, still attached to a portion of the forward fuselage, began to plummet toward the ocean. The pilots, though trained to respond to emergencies, were rendered powerless. Communication with air traffic control was severed, and the controls were unresponsive. All that remained was the terrible realization that the plane was no longer under their command. In the passenger cabin, survival instincts kicked in for those who could still react. Amidst the blinding light and ear-splitting noise, some passengers clung to their seats, their minds racing to comprehend the impossible. Others, caught in the shockwave, were thrown from their places, colliding with walls and ceilings as the cabin buckled under the force of the explosion. The air was thick with smoke and debris, and the screams of terror and pain were drowned out by the unrelenting roar of destruction. As the aircraft disintegrated midair, large sections began to break away, spiraling toward the Atlantic below. The wings, carrying fuel reserves, erupted into additional fireballs, their flaming wreckage illuminating the night sky. The tail section, detached from the main body, tumbled through the air, while smaller fragments of the fuselage scattered like confetti. For the passengers, there was no semblance of control or comprehension. Those in the rear sections, separated from the initial explosion, experienced a brief moment of freefall before impact with the ocean ended their lives. On the ground, the fiery descent of Flight 800 was witnessed by hundreds of people. Boaters, fishermen, and beachgoers along the Long Island coast described seeing a streak of light followed by a massive explosion. Some reported a loud boom that echoed across the water, while others claimed to see debris raining from the sky. To those unfamiliar with aviation disasters, the sight was incomprehensible. Speculation began immediately. Was it a terrorist attack? A missile strike? A catastrophic failure of the plane itself? The U.S. Coast Guard was among the first to respond. Their vessels, stationed nearby, rushed toward the crash site, guided by the fiery glow still visible on the ocean's surface. Helicopters joined the effort, their searchlights cutting through the dark waters in search of survivors. But as rescue teams reached the area, it became clear that the devastation was absolute. Flaming wreckage floated on the water, alongside luggage, seats, and other fragments of the plane. There were no signs of life. The impact of the crash had been so severe that most of the wreckage sank quickly to the ocean floor. The search and recovery effort became a race against time as rescuers sought to retrieve bodies and crucial evidence before tides and currents scattered the remains. Divers, working in treacherous conditions, began the grim task of recovering victims and identifying pieces of the aircraft that could provide answers. The wreckage was spread over a debris field measuring several miles, complicating the operation. On shore, families of the victims, who had been anxiously awaiting updates on their loved ones, were met with devastating news. At JFK Airport, where many had gathered to see the plane off or meet its arrival in Paris, grief and disbelief took hold. Airline officials and emergency personnel struggled to provide comfort while also managing the logistics of one of the worst air disasters in U.S. history. Across the Atlantic in France, relatives awaiting the plane's arrival were similarly devastated, their joy transformed into anguish with a single phone call. The sheer scale of the tragedy made it a national event. News networks interrupted programming to report on the crash, broadcasting images of the burning wreckage and rescue efforts. Experts speculated on the cause, but in the absence of official information, rumors spread rapidly. Witness accounts of a streak of light fed theories of a missile or explosive device. Some suggested that the aging Boeing 747 had suffered a critical mechanical failure. As investigators descended on the scene, they faced immense pressure to unravel the mystery. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, alongside the FBI and other agencies, launched one of the largest investigations in aviation history. The recovery operation, led by Navy and Coast Guard teams, focused on bringing as much of the wreckage as possible to the surface. Every piece of debris, no matter how small, was scrutinized for clues. Black boxes, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, became critical targets in the search, as they held the potential to reveal the final moments before the explosion. As the investigation continued, the human toll of the disaster became increasingly evident. The families of the victims faced not only the pain of losing their loved ones, but also the anguish of waiting for answers. In many cases, bodies were recovered in fragments, requiring extensive forensic analysis for identification. Memorial services were held across the country, each one a solemn reminder of the lives cut short in an instant. For the residents of Montoursville, Pennsylvania, the loss of 16 students and their chaperones cast a long shadow over the tight-knit community. Vigils and tributes reflected the depth of their sorrow, as well as their determination to honor the memories of those they had lost. As days turned into weeks, the crash of Flight 800 became a touchstone for grief and speculation. For those directly affected, the tragedy was deeply personal, a wound that time struggled to heal. For the public, it was a mystery demanding resolution. The fiery explosion, the absence of survivors, and the conflicting accounts of witnesses made the disaster a subject of fascination and fear. Across the country, passengers boarding planes wondered if their flight, too, could end in disaster. Even as the recovery operation continued, the search for answers grew more urgent. Investigators faced a monumental task, piecing together thousands of fragments of the aircraft to reconstruct what had gone wrong. The story of Flight 800, now etched into history, was far from over. The aftermath of TWA Flight 800's crash unfolded as one of the most exhaustive and controversial investigations in aviation history. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, took the lead, working alongside the FBI, Navy divers, forensic scientists, and other agencies. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented. Debris retrieval efforts stretched across weeks, with recovery teams navigating treacherous underwater conditions to bring pieces of the wreckage to the surface. Each fragment, no matter how small, held the potential to unravel the mystery of what caused the midair explosion. The first breakthrough came when search teams recovered the plane's black boxes. The flight data recorder, FDR, and cockpit voice recorder, CVR. These devices, designed to withstand extreme conditions, offered critical insight into the final moments before the crash. Analysis of the FDR revealed no unusual data leading up to the explosion, while the CVR captured only a routine flight deck exchange, ending abruptly at the moment of the blast. The recordings offered little in the way of definitive answers but provided valuable context for investigators. As the investigation progressed, the recovered wreckage was transported to a hangar, where experts painstakingly reassembled the aircraft. The reconstruction process was akin to solving a massive, three-dimensional puzzle, with each piece offering a clue to the sequence of events that led to the explosion. Investigators quickly ruled out pilot error, as the crew's actions prior to the crash were entirely in line with standard procedures. Attention shifted to the aircraft itself, its structure, systems, and the possibility of external interference. The FBI initially treated the incident as a possible act of terrorism. The 1990s were a decade marked by heightened fears of international and domestic threats, including the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. Witness accounts of a streak of light ascending toward the plane before the explosion fueled theories of a missile strike. Some speculated that the flight had been targeted by a surface-to-air missile, either as part of a terrorist attack or a tragic military accident. These theories gained traction in the media, creating a swirl of speculation that added pressure to the official investigation. To explore these claims, the FBI conducted extensive interviews with witnesses and analyzed radar data from the area. They also examined the wreckage for evidence of explosive residue or missile impact. The process was meticulous, with every piece of debris subjected to forensic analysis. Despite the public's fixation on the missile theory, investigators found no conclusive evidence to support it. The absence of any telltale missile fragments or explosive traces pointed them back toward a different cause, a catastrophic mechanical failure. The NTSB eventually concluded that the explosion originated in the aircraft's center wing fuel tank, a large cavity located near the middle of the fuselage. This tank, nearly empty during the flight, was filled with a mixture of fuel vapor and air. Under normal conditions, this vapor posed no threat, but investigators discovered that an electrical short circuit had likely ignited the fumes. The short circuit originated in wiring connected to the fuel quantity indication system, which was located in close proximity to the tank. The resulting spark triggered an explosion that ripped through the aircraft, setting off the chain of events that led to its disintegration. This finding marked a turning point in the investigation, but it also sparked controversy. Some experts and members of the public were dissatisfied with the official explanation, arguing that it left too many questions unanswered. The missile theory persisted, fueled by eyewitness accounts and conspiracy theories that gained traction in books, documentaries, and online forums. For years, debate raged over whether the NTSB's conclusion was accurate or if critical evidence had been overlooked or deliberately suppressed. In the midst of these disputes, the families of the victims sought closure. Many channeled their grief into advocacy, calling for improved safety standards to prevent similar tragedies. Their efforts were not in vain. In response to the crash, the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, implemented new regulations aimed at reducing the risk of fuel tank explosions. These measures included requiring airlines to install inerting systems that replaced oxygen in fuel tanks with non-flammable gases, significantly lowering the chances of ignition. The legacy of Flight 800 extended beyond regulatory changes. The crash became a case study in aviation safety, influencing how investigators approach complex accidents. It underscored the importance of meticulous maintenance for aging aircraft, especially those with extensive wiring systems. The tragedy also highlighted the psychological toll on the families of victims, prompting airlines and agencies to improve their crisis response protocols. Support groups and memorials emerged, providing spaces for collective mourning and remembrance. In Montoursville, Pennsylvania, where the loss of 16 students and 5 chaperones hit particularly hard, the community rallied to honor their memory. A memorial garden was established, its centerpiece a sculpture symbolizing hope and resilience. Across the country, similar tributes appeared, each a testament to the lives lost and the profound impact of their absence. Decades later, TWA Flight 800 remains a poignant reminder of the delicate balance between safety and risk in modern aviation. The explosion over Long Island that summer night irrevocably altered the lives of those it touched and reshaped the industry it shook to its core. While the questions surrounding the crash may never be fully resolved, its lessons endure, a legacy written in regulations, memorials, and the enduring pursuit of answers.